Somewhere along the way, without you ever standing in a lineup or knowing you were even being measured against anyone else at all, someone ran the numbers quietly, privately, without ever announcing it to a single soul. Not literally 1,000 people, maybe, but enough conversations, enough almosts, enough people who came close and then quietly didn't, enough comparisons made in the back of someone's mind long before they ever said a single word to you about any of it. And every single time, without exception, you came out ahead. That's not a guess, and it's not a compliment dressed up to sound bigger than it actually is in the moment. That's simply what actually happens when someone finally settles on choosing a person deliberately with their eyes fully open instead of drifting into it by accident or convenience without ever really deciding at all. Most people don't talk about this part out loud, the comparing itself, even though nearly everyone does it in one form or another. It sounds unflattering when you say it plainly, almost cold, like reducing a whole person down to a checklist or a spreadsheet somewhere. But it's how real decisions actually get made underneath all the romance, all the timing, all the surface-level feelings, a quiet, ongoing evaluation running constantly in the background of every interaction someone has, whether they'd ever admit it out loud or not. And if you're the one who kept winning that evaluation over and over against every single alternative that ever crossed their path along the way, whether that alternative was a real person or just a passing thought about what else might be out there, that's genuinely worth understanding fully, not brushing off as simple flattery meant to make you feel good for a moment and then forgotten. There's a version of this that shows up in the smallest, most ordinary exchanges. Someone else says something a little off, a little disappointing, falls slightly short in some small way, and without meaning to, without any conscious effort at all, a comparison fires immediately in the background. Not a dramatic one, not something they'd even notice happening in real time. Just a flicker, a quiet internal note that says, this isn't quite it, this doesn't land the way it should, the way it used to with you. That flicker happens because a standard already exists somewhere inside them, already set, already fully proven through repeated experience. You set that standard whether you meant to or not. Nobody handed them a rule book for what right actually looks like in a person, no external guide they could reference to know what to look for. You became the rule book yourself, entirely on your own, just by being consistently, ordinarily yourself around them, day after day, without ever trying to audition for the role or perform for the position. Think about how many people someone actually encounters over the course of years, not just months, co-workers, acquaintances, people they dated briefly and forgot within weeks, people they almost dated but never quite got around to, people who seemed promising for a stretch of time and then quietly, unremarkably weren't anymore. Every single one of those people got weighed, even briefly, even without a formal process attached to it, against whatever internal sense of this could actually work someone was carrying around at the time. Most of them didn't clear the bar. Most of them fell short in ways that were easy to move past and forget entirely, small disqualifying details that made the comparison end quickly without much thought given to it afterward. You did clear it, though, consistently, repeatedly. Not because you were trying to compete for the position, not because you were performing for an audience you didn't even know existed at the time, but because who you actually are, without any extra effort applied, turned out to be exactly what kept measuring up against everyone else who tried. It's worth sitting with how much effort it usually takes for someone to actually let go of comparing entirely, to stop running that quiet background evaluation altogether. Most people don't stop comparing because they got tired of doing it, worn down by the process itself. They stop because the comparison stopped being close enough to bother continuing. At some point, continuing to measure new people against you started to feel almost unnecessary, almost redundant, like checking whether the sky is still up there every single morning before leaving the house. The gap between you and every available alternative got wide enough, over time, that the exercise itself lost its purpose entirely and simply fell away. You probably don't know most of the specific moments where this actually happened, and you likely never will in any concrete, verifiable detail. That's simply the nature of it. Comparisons like this rarely get announced out loud, rarely get formally acknowledged in an actual conversation between two people. Nobody walks up to someone and says, plainly and directly, out loud, "You're better than the last 3 people I talked to before you, and here's exactly why." It happens privately, internally, in moments you are never present for and never will be present for, moments that unfolded entirely inside someone else's head, invisible to you completely, but the aggregate result of all those private, invisible moments, stacked up quietly over months and years without you ever once being aware of them happening in real time, is the person who's here now, choosing you consistently, day after day, without needing convincing, without needing constant reminders of what they already concluded a long time ago, because the case was already made, repeatedly, thoroughly, long before this particular point in the relationship. There's a real difference between being chosen once and being chosen repeatedly, over and over across time, and it's worth taking a moment to understand which one you actually have here. A single choice can be impulsive, situational, easily reversed the moment the right pressure comes along, the right distraction, the right convenient alternative. A repeated choice, made again and again across different moods, different circumstances, different versions of a person's life as it changes and evolves over time, is something else entirely, something far more solid. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen without real evaluation behind it. It happens because every fresh comparison, every new opportunity that could have gone a different direction, keeps landing on the exact same conclusion over and over without fail. You don't need to perform to maintain any of this, and that's worth genuinely internalizing. This matters more than it might seem to at first. If someone chose you after genuinely comparing you to real, actual alternatives that existed in their life, and kept choosing you afterward over and over, that choice isn't contingent on you being flawless, endlessly impressive, or constantly proving your worth all over again. It's built on something far steadier than that, the accumulated weight of who you actually are on completely ordinary days, not just the highlight reel version of yourself that shows up for special occasions. That's a far more durable foundation than anything built on performance alone, because performance eventually runs out of material to draw from, always, eventually, no matter how impressive it once was, and steady simply doesn't run out the same way. It's worth acknowledging clearly that being compared favorably isn't the same as being perfect, and nobody watching this should mistake the two. Nobody's claiming you have no flaws whatsoever, no bad days, no moments where you weren't your best self, weren't patient, weren't easy to be around. What actually happened is simpler and more honest than perfection ever could be. Even with every single flaw fully visible, fully known, even having seen you on genuinely hard days and difficult weeks and moments you'd rather forget, the comparison still tilted toward you every time. That's a much stronger, more meaningful form of being chosen than being picked for some idealized, flawless version of yourself that doesn't actually exist anywhere in reality, that was never real to begin with. There's something worth noticing in how effortless this comparison ended up being on their end, even though it might not feel effortless at all from your side of things looking back. You may have spent real time and energy wondering whether you measured up, worrying quietly whether you were enough compared to whoever else might have been in the picture, real or imagined, at some point in their life. Meanwhile, on the other side of that entire worry, the comparison was already settled long ago, quietly, without any drama attached to it, without you ever needing to campaign for the outcome or convince anyone of your worth at all. You were simply already winning a competition you didn't even know you were entered in, over and over, without a single moment of doubt from the other side of it, without a single close call that ever seriously threatened the outcome. People sometimes assume that being chosen means being the safest, most convenient option available at the time, the path of least resistance someone just happened to fall into because it was easier than putting in effort elsewhere. That's rarely actually true, and it's worth pushing back on that assumption directly. Convenience gets abandoned easily the moment something slightly easier, slightly more exciting, slightly less demanding comes along to compete for attention. What you're describing here, someone who compared you against a genuinely large field of real alternatives and kept landing on you specifically again and again, isn't convenience at all. It's closer to conviction, a settled, hard-won certainty that took real, honest evaluation to arrive at, not some shortcut anyone took just to avoid the effort of actually deciding. It's also worth knowing that this kind of comparison doesn't stay locked in the past, doesn't just live as some old settled verdict from a single moment long gone by and forgotten. It's ongoing, active, continuously renewed with every new circumstance that comes along. Every new person who enters their life, every new interaction, every fresh possibility that could theoretically compete for their attention or their affection at some point down the line, runs through the exact same quiet filter it always has from the very beginning, and you keep clearing it every single time, without exception, without a single close call along the way that anyone's ever mentioned. That's not a one-time verdict handed down months or years ago and then forgotten about. That's a standing conclusion that gets reaffirmed continuously, quietly, in ways you'll probably never fully witness firsthand, in moments that happen entirely without your knowledge. You don't need external proof of any of this to know it's actually true, though it's completely fair and reasonable to want some anyway, some concrete, visible confirmation beyond just trusting the pattern quietly on faith alone. The proof shows up in consistency, in someone who stays present, day after day, week after week, who chooses you again on completely ordinary days when nothing dramatic is happening to force the decision one way or another, who doesn't need a crisis, a scare, or a competing option to suddenly appear before they remember what they already knew all along. Deep down the whole time, that kind of steady, unglamorous presence, sustained over time without needing constant renewal through drama or grand gestures, tells you far more than any single dramatic moment or grand romantic gesture ever could on its own. Notice, too, the way they talk about you when comparing isn't even the point of the conversation, when it just slips out naturally in passing. The way certain things about you come up unprompted, admiringly, in conversations that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone. That kind of casual, unguarded admiration is often more telling than anything said directly to your face, precisely because there was no audience to perform for and no reason to exaggerate. There's a version of confidence that comes specifically from knowing you were chosen through genuine comparison, not through default or a simple lack of alternatives, and it's worth letting that confidence settle in fully rather than second-guessing it constantly the way so many people do out of habit. A lot of people spend years wondering, quietly, if they were simply the person who happened to be available at the right moment, the convenient option nobody bothered to look past, because looking past it required more effort than anyone wanted to spend. Knowing the actual comparison happened in detail over time and knowing exactly how it resolved every single time removes that particular anxiety entirely, permanently. You weren't a default setting someone settled into out of convenience. You were an active, deliberate conclusion someone arrived at after genuinely looking around at everything else available to them. It's also worth understanding that this kind of comparison rarely gets reversed once it's settled this thoroughly, once it's been tested repeatedly across enough time and enough real opportunities to go a different direction. People sometimes worry that being chosen today means nothing guaranteed about tomorrow, that the comparison could theoretically flip the moment a new, more exciting option happens to appear out of nowhere. In practice, once someone has run this evaluation enough times, against enough real alternatives, in enough different circumstances, and kept arriving at the exact same conclusion every single time, the process itself gradually becomes less about active, ongoing comparison and more about simple, settled fact, something no longer even up for debate internally. The question mostly stops being asked at all because it's already been answered so many times, so consistently, that asking it again would feel almost redundant. There's also something worth saying about how you show up specifically in their unguarded moments, the ones where nobody's performing for anyone else, where there's no audience present at all to shape what gets said, the way your name comes up when they're relaxed, tired, or simply being completely themselves without any filter applied, without any effort to manage how something sounds. Those are usually the moments that reveal the truest version of how someone actually feels underneath everything else, far more honestly and reliably than anything said during a planned, formal conversation where both people know exactly what's being discussed and why. There's also a version of this worth mentioning that has nothing to do with romance specifically, even though most of this has been framed that way so far throughout the video. People compare their friends against other friends they've had over the years, their close family relationships against more distant ones, even the way they feel supported by one particular person against how supported they've felt by others throughout different chapters of their life. If you keep coming out ahead across more than one type of relationship entirely, more than one category of comparison altogether, more than one context where people occasionally, quietly, size up who's actually shown up for them, that's not a coincidence limited to one specific context or one specific role you play in someone's life. That's simply who you are, consistently showing up the same way across every single kind of connection someone might ever measure against another. It's worth noting, too, that the version of you they compare everyone else to isn't some polished, curated highlight reel you present strategically, some carefully managed image built specifically to impress. It's the whole picture, unfiltered and complete, how you handle stress when things go wrong, how you show up on a genuinely bad day when there's nothing left in the tank, how you treat people even when there's absolutely nothing to gain from being kind, patient, or generous with your time. That's a harder, more honest standard to set than most people realize when they first hear it described this way, and it's exactly the standard you've apparently been clearing, consistently, without ever once trying to clear it on purpose or consciously curate anything about how you show up. Consider also how genuinely rare it actually is for someone to keep comparing at all once they've been with a person for a meaningful stretch of time, once the relationship has had plenty of opportunity to settle into something more passive. Most relationships eventually settle into a kind of comfortable autopilot where active comparison simply stops happening altogether, not necessarily because the person has been proven singularly exceptional, but simply because the effort of comparing fades on its own over time. Regardless of the actual outcome, regardless of whether the person deserved that continued scrutiny or not. If comparisons are still happening here actively and still resolving in your favor every single time without fail, that tells you something important. The relationship hasn't slipped into that kind of autopilot at all. It's still being actively, consciously, deliberately chosen over and over on purpose.